Inverted Orthodoxy Q&A podcast. We are here and we're missing Kyle to my right because he's back behind the cameras running things today.
He's actually going to be joining us in just a minute. He's just making sure the sound is all good, and then he will be here.
He will be here.
He will be here.
All right.
So if you're feeling like, oh man,
Kyle's
I
my
always
favorite
like
guy.
Kyle's input, or if you're like, oh, I wonder what heresy Kyle had to say this week, don't worry, you're not going to miss it. Whether that's for good or bad.
All right.
So
Good.
But anyway,
We do have some...
while we wait for Kyle, he'll be here in just a minute. Last week I mentioned seeing Godzilla. You came with me.
Yeah.
What did you think?
It was awesome.
It was really good.
Yeah. Yeah. Different feel being a Japanese movie.
Yeah.
But it's good. Good story. Very enjoyable. I liked it all the way. So.
I told my wife that was the most enjoyable experience I've had at the movies in years.
Wow.
And not just because I was like really looking forward to Godzilla, because I was.
Yeah.
But that movie is like, critics are loving it. It's it actually came in third in the U.S. last weekend.
Oh, really?
Wow.
Yeah, even though it's in limited theaters.
Wow, that's
So-
amazing.
Yeah, it was very good. I can't remember when, but at some point years ago, you told me you liked Godzilla, and then I watched a majority of them, or as many as we could find with my kids, like especially during COVID and stuff. We just binge watched lots of Godzilla, so I was looking forward when I heard this one was coming, and you said you were going. I was like, yeah, I'm going too. So it was fun.
Yeah.
Kyle, welcome.
Hey, great to be here. I will welcome AER on our audio quality this week. We've just shifted over to a new audio interface. So if you are listening to this, I know one of the things that has regularly happened is our podcast volume has generally been low in comparison to other podcasts. This should help solve that, as well as the quality of all of our voices. As long as, gentlemen, we stay close to our mics, then it should be even better quality.
I
than
bet
we're
you the
used to.
sound of that creaking when you moved
It
your
might
mic
have gone
was
through.
really, really good.
Yeah.
People are like, wow, that is quality.
That is quality. I can hear the creaking.
It is the Rode ProMaster 3200 or something like that.
The Rodecaster 2 Pro 2.
I knew there was Pro in there.
Yeah, Rodecaster
So,
Pro 2.
And it also has buttons on it that you can do like sound effects.
Yes, and we accidentally were playing with that when I was showing Keelan the unit, and then she had one stuck on when she went to record Blake's live teaching
I
last
was
week.
a robot.
So we will, when Keelan's here, one of the things I've been talking about is there's a podcast, Holy Post, that I listen to. And when they make a reference to a resource of any kind, whether it be a book or a movie, there's a little chime, and I'm totally planning to steal that. So if we mention a book, bing, she can hit that on there.
So what does that accomplish?
Just allows you to like kind of catch that audio feed of, there's a book just mentioned, and catch that was important.
But you're not going to be able to go back and be like, listen for the chime.
No, but just like kind of makes note that we were talking about.
You're trying to train someone like Pavlov's dog. That's what you're really trying to do, right?
to-
Make
buy
more
books
people
on Amazon.
read. Yes, read more.
Okay, so my
That little
question...
guy Jeff Bezos needs some more money, so I'm just trying to help
He
him out.
does. He wants to go back to space, and we need to help him. After the first time he went to space, he thanked us all.
Yeah.
So, could we not, on one of those custom buttons, put in the AER
Audio?
audio thing?
Yes, but not the video.
Oh, right. We would, our video listeners would lose out.
Yeah.
So that'd be unfortunate. Because I was thinking with the tech issues we've had with that, we just press that button.
That one I think should be all right. So why don't we give it a go now? Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations. Boom.
We need to remember to bring back our live video.
If you're on audio only, go watch just that little bit.
Oops.
That was awesome.
Worked audio-wise. So we got some AER last week.
We did. We had questions about pastors being weird, and it says AER on weirdness. Doug likes the smell of coffee, but doesn't like to drink coffee.
I don't think that's weird at all. I know other people who are the same way. My wife. So my son. So full disclosure, Kyle, you've been on staff for 9 years now.
Yep.
And as part of your initial role, you were the youth, negative patterns that were transferred to Brock.
Yeah.
Specifically regarding coffee.
Yeah.
And then Brock became the youth pastor.
Yep.
And Brock was very instrumental in my son's life.
Yep.
And again, in many positive ways, impacted Nick's life.
Yep.
But in a negative way, there's been this generational sin
Yep.
that's been handed down from you to Brock to now Nick of coffee snobbery.
I've teased Nick that he's my spiritual coffee grandson.
Yes, that sounds about right.
Because when I've got, I'm like, you don't like coffee, and I worked
So
on it
you
ever
shamed
since.
him into it.
I did.
So this has been passed down that now Nick we used to just have a kettle because Lorelei likes tea. Now we have a little coffee station.
Yep.
And Nick keeps his coffee beans. The other day, Lorelei just opened up the bag of coffee and just smelled it. She was like, I love the smell of coffee. It smells so much better than it tastes.
Right.
So
That has always been my argument about tea. I was just saying this to Blake actually just upstairs as I was making us fresh coffee for the podcast. Was my complaint about tea is it always smells excellent. I will fully admit that. And then you go to drink it and you have 6% of the flavor you just smelled. You're like, what is this?
Tea just tastes like hot water.
Yes.
People are like, oh, this is a really good tea. And I'm like, is it though?
I don't know if that's a thing.
We've now moved on to we don't just offend people with theology, we offend people with their coffee,
We're
tea
here to
drinking.
offend everyone.
We are equal opportunity offenders.
Just gonna make sure we're going live.
So-
Yeah.
So I don't think that's weird at all. So,
Fair.
and Kyle, did you say someone you know also prefers the smell to the
No,
taste
I
of
was
coffee?
mentioning my mom used to always say when she was older, she was going to start lighting cigars and putting them on her mantle because she loved the smell of cigars,
Oh,
but
yeah.
Didn't ever want to smoke one.
All the enjoyment of cigars without the cancer.
There you go.
That's a great idea. I'd agree with that.
Right?
Cigars do smell good, yeah.
They do smell excellent. I was also made this joke to Blake last week was that all my Reformed friends, they are really into smoking and drinking hard alcohol. So
Yeah.
I know a lot of them will sit around and have whiskey and cigars and talk theology. I'm like, that needs to come over outside of Reformed traditions.
Well, that is, if you know your church history,
Yes.
was it one of the Wesleys that was for his entire life was like a cigar smoker and a whiskey drinker?
Right.
I'm not sure. I can't remember if it was one of the
Spurgeon
Wesleys.
was hard on both
Spurgeon.
forever.
That's who I'm thinking of. I couldn't remember who it was, but it was Spurgeon.
And
yes.
there's a quote that I am sad to admit was not true, but has been largely attributed to Spurgeon. But I still say it all the time, that beer is proof that God exists and loves us. And I think that's just so good.
So now we've offended all.
Yeah.
But
Got
if we
everybody covered.
hadn't before, now
Like
we
you
have.
said, equal opportunity here on our podcast.
We should get into some questions.
All right. Question number 1 today. I'm trying to decide whether to sign my organ donor card. And then I read 1 Corinthians 6, verses 13 to 15. And it seems to say that our bodies are not just physical entities like food. I don't know what to make of all of this.
So to just help out, I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 6, and I'm actually going to start at verse 12. And we're going to go, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be enslaved by anything. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord, and will raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. So, Kyle, do you want to begin since I read the scripture?
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in. I would say, though this is based on a question around organ donors, this same conversation I think has been really relevant for people talking about whether Christians should get cremated, right? Should I get cremated because Jesus seems to talk about our body, or Paul seems to talk about our bodies being important, which is a really fair question and concern. Some Christians have long still continued to not get cremated for those reasons.
Yep.
I know that was a conversation growing up. The kind of catchy phrase was, when I go, I don't want to be anywhere near fire in this world or the next one. Would hear those kind of things.
All right.
And I get it. I empathize, and there's a lot of kind of weird feelings around death. For me, really starting with this question of what this means, I would start to take it as Paul is trying to emphasize and kind of counter response to more dualistic thinking of our bodies separate from our souls, and thinking like the Gnostics were just we are just right now embodied souls and minds, that later these things will be done away with, and as all things are made as pure as possible, bodies won't matter.
Yep.
And clearly the incarnation says our world matters. We are in the environment that God deemed good. So I think Paul, by using this phrase, is trying to say all of our self matters. To then kind of jump in with the whole part of our bodies and resurrection, like God's got some work to do. I heard this joke. I just like bringing these examples because they help connect it for me. If you haven't seen somebody in 7 years and you run into them, you're not obligated to say hi because it's an entirely different person than when you last saw them. Because your cells, you're in your body, every cell is replaced every 7 years.
Right.
And so we are constantly having cell death to even have life. The very fact that our bodies are functioning is because of cell death. So when we are buried, even if we're just buried without being cremated, our bodies then decay and become soil and all the things. It's how we have life on this planet, is the decay and creation of soil that way, which is a really important part of our environment. And so from a cellular level, God's got a lot of work to do to bring our bodies back one way or another. And so whether you are giving away your organs or not, or you're cremated or not, God has the plan and the know-how from the promises he's made to put our bodies back together one way or another. Most of us are not going to die and be resurrected within 3 days like Jesus' body was. So that, I know that's long, but I think it's an important conversation. I'll cut myself off for a bit here.
So I would begin by saying I appreciate this person's desire to honor Christ.
Yep, very much so.
My personal conviction is I think that we can honor Christ through organ donating as well. That's just one final act of love we can give to somebody and do that. I'm not obligating you to do it, but I'm saying if you're already wrestling with that, I would say this verse is not saying don't engage in organ donation. The context of this verse is sexual immorality and what we're doing with our body while we're alive. Not so much worried about it after we die. I would also say that it's something that if we don't understand the details of how everything's going to work on the other side of death, the resurrection, we have this hope that we hold on to. We see Jesus with a resurrected body. So we know there is a body that he has. What do you do? What does that say to people who were burned at the stake for their faith? Do those people
They're out of luck.
not have...
Sorry, guys, you were too faithful.
You're martyred, which we do admire, but you didn't make it.
If only you'd been martyred.
Too bad they took your body.
By being just impaled.
Yeah.
So we have these, like, we can't, and even not just even that. There's lots of crazy ways that people have died that oftentimes have caused their bodies to be destroyed in the process, not just because they chose to be cremated. So we trust that in those instances, God is going to be able to do enough of a resurrection work that there will be a wholeness to them, and that what death has taken in that instance will not be permanent. So in the same way, I feel like if that's something that's on your heart to do, is sign your organ donor card, and you do that. I think you can trust that God has the ability to restore even through that act. First, stop you if that's something that you're thinking. But I do like that you're thinking about the realities of what I believe and how it impacts my faith. I remember years ago, I can't remember which N.T. Wright book it is, but one of N.T. Wright's books, he begins the book talking about how there was a time when every Christian would be buried. None of them would be cremated. And he talks about this change. And he goes on to talk about just the change in thinking that it represents. And it was a book on having a worldview of that they're incorporating their faith into these decisions. I think that's awesome. And I want to say good work.
Yeah.
I think, I just think, I do commend, like you say, people for thinking out their faith, right? I think that there is verses, maybe this one I think is more to do with sexual immorality, but there is other verses in other places where we're instructed to care for our bodies and take care of them because God has given them to. I just think they're a gift and they're to be used to bless ourselves and other people while we're living. But then I think on the other side of just how often we think God is very judgmental or has these rules that are so strict. And I just continue to think, even this week, I had a conversation with a couple of people where I'm like, God is just so merciful.
So much more merciful than we realize.
Full of grace. Like he just forgives and has patience for us while we're alive. That is incredible. Like Christians who have lived any length of time with God, if they actually stop and think about it, would tell story after story of God's grace in their life, of how, where they think that they have messed up or done something sinful, they know they've acted wrong and would expect God to treat them in a certain way. Yeah. And it's been totally the opposite.
Yep.
So then if we think that through a little bit, and when it comes to something like death, if we think that God is going to hold us accountable for cremation or for doing something with our organs or whatever else, that is going to limit our ability to partake of his goodness in whatever happens after death, I think would be like, it's just not, for me, that's not rational thinking.
Right.
If I expect God to be as loving and merciful as he is, I just don't think that that's going to disqualify us. Yeah. Whether it happens, like you say, through an accident or something outside of my, will, that I die in a messy, thing, or whether I guess I believe cremation's okay and God's like, well, I didn't really want that. But I just think that his mercy and grace extends far more than we as Christians sometimes allow ourselves to think. We get locked into these ideas of what, God will do. Yeah. Even had this discussion with my brother this week saying, we invite people in to Christianity, sinful in all ways, and say, God has mercy and grace for you. Yeah. And then they get saved, and we say, here's all the rules and the things that may disqualify you from his grace. Yeah. I just, when I say that aloud, I'm like, that does not add up. It doesn't make sense that he died, this torturous death on a cross for everything except after you get saved. Mm-hmm. Then his mercy doesn't extend to that anymore. Yep. That's weird. So that's my take on that.
Yep.
I've got one passage that may support organ donation. I say this in jest. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust already has committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it from you. For it's far better that one of your members be destroyed than your whole body in heaven or hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better that you have one of your limbs be destroyed than your whole body go into hell. So as long as you're giving your organ donations to heathens, you're fine.
There you go. And if they're sinful. Man, my kidney has been just so bad lately.
I just used it. I just thought it came to me that there are parts of the Jesus teaching that come back to cutting out limbs.
And that, people, is what we call eisegesis.
If you want a practical example, there she be. Oh, man.
All right. Well, getting a little more serious, bringing us back. Let's go to the next question. I have been listening to some new outlets and podcasts on the Israel and Hamas conflict. I do not condone the actions of Hamas, but I have recently learned that the Israeli government has been oppressing Palestinians since about 1948, when Jews were presented the land as a symbol of reconciliation after the atrocities of World War II. Mm-hmm. However, over time, they have taken over the land and have pushed the Palestinians out of the land that they have had for centuries before. I have two questions. Many Christians would say that Israel has the right to fight because it is God's land for the Jews, and even after these attacks. However, this government has been oppressing Palestinians and Palestinian Christians. There is theology surrounding these views. Do you think that some Christians have some wrong views on Israel, particularly when it comes to the end-time theology? And second, what should our response be as Christians to this conflict? Again, not condoning the heinous actions of Hamas, however, maybe wanting to bring some awareness that this did not just happen suddenly. Mm-hmm. There's been more going on than we may have been aware of.
Short answer, yes. Some Christians have wrong views on everything.
Yes.
And I'll say every Christian has wrong views on something. So we'll go so far as to say that before we get into this. It is... our hope is not in having right theology. Our hope is in the person of Jesus.
Yep. Amen.
That is where our hope is. And I think that it is really terrible that we have become so concerned about orthodoxy. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about orthodoxy, but I feel like we're out of balance, that we don't care at all about orthopraxy, which is right behavior, whereas orthodoxy is right beliefs. And to the point that we're so focused on orthodoxy that we don't have any grace for anyone who would think differently on us. Now, that's a very macro view. I haven't even begun answering this question. So there's a lot of questions. There's numerous questions in here. Mm-hmm. I think that when you get to the place, I think that if you're being told that Christians have to support everything that the current nation of Israel does, I don't think that is in any way, there's no biblical foundation for that at all.
Yep.
If you go back to the Old Testament, where you had the original nation of Israel that was the people of God who God had selected for the purpose of bringing the Messiah,
Yep.
there was not universal support for everything they did.
Correct.
The Old Testament...
It's a lot of the prophets.
But that's all... Well, yeah, some of the prophets are to other nations,
Yeah.
but literally the prophets are there going...
Critiquing their own
You're
nation.
doing some things wrong. So this idea that is in the North American church, that we have to endorse and support everything that the nation of Israel does, I think is not thoughtful.
Correct.
And I think the problem that we often have in the church is that we don't have a thoughtful faith. We hear, Jesus saying you must become like a child. And I think sometimes we have a childish faith, not a childlike faith.
Yep.
And Brian Zond, and when I'm looking at it right now, when everything's on fire, ding, he talks about working through the difficulties and the complexities of faith,
Yep.
and then coming back to a place of naivete,
Yep.
and coming back to a place of simplicity. And I think that there is an element of that that's true. There's certainly an element of that I've discovered in my own life. Mm-hmm. The simplicity that comes on the other side of wrestling through the complexity. But I think a lot of times Christians aren't willing to engage through the difficult journey of wrestling with complexities. And as a result, they end up with the wrong simplicity. And I think that the nation of Israel is one of the places that manifests itself on a wide scale within the church.
Yep.
That I have heard and I have seen numerous times in churches, TV ministries, different places. Like, you need to support everything Israel does.
Yep.
And I go, I disagree with that. I don't think that is reasonable.
Agreed.
Can I jump in on that? Because we had this discussion off air a few weeks ago. There's a thought that I've heard quite a few times, probably on TV ministry more than anything. So that'd be, out of the U.S. probably.
Yep.
But this idea that we need to bless Israel, and those that bless Israel will be blessed, and those that curse Israel will be cursed.
Yep.
And I was asking us where that came from, and we came up with a verse in Numbers.
So there's one in Numbers and Genesis when Abraham gets his promise from God. God says, "I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you." And later
I came
gets
across
clarified
this Genesis 12.
Yeah.
I think I heard it this past week.
Yep.
Yeah, 12:3. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. But it made me stop and think when I heard whoever said that, because I was like, this is like to Abraham, like before Israel's ever a nation, before he has any children, before anything even happens.
Yeah.
And yet, for probably a North American theology, somehow it's got to this place where, in the US of A, they did something along the way, and I don't know the details, but there'd be people who could back this up, that somehow they backed Israel on something.
Yep.
And then they believe that that's why they become such a godly nation and all this stuff has happened and it's so good. And then other nations that have problems is because, they've dishonored Israel and attacked them and all the rest, right?
Yeah.
But I was just saying that to give some clarity to what you were saying, Doug, as to how we've got to this idea that no matter what Israel does here in North America, we just say, we're pro-Israel.
But
right?
I think, okay, so what does that mean that America is blessed and other nations aren't? Because there's nations in the Middle East that are completely anti-Israel that are financially prosperous, and that's typically how we view
True.
like America's blessing, and in North America, that's how we typically view blessing.
Yeah.
We normally say blessing is success and materialism, which is weird because that wasn't Jesus, and that wasn't the disciples, and that wasn't the early church.
Or even God speaking to Abraham and
But Abraham had
has financial means.
He has financial blessing. He ends up with large flocks. In fact, him and Lot have to split because of all the flocks. So I'm not saying it can't,
Right.
but it's not the only definition. And if we if we think along those lines, then you take someone like Mother Teresa and you're like, well, it's too bad she wasn't blessed.
Yeah.
Which I'm like, well, I think we'd all have a problem with that.
And I think
Go ahead.
I was gonna say I also think the definition of what it means for the person to do the blessing also has to be called into question. The abusive alcoholic spouse, to bless them all the time is not to leave them unquestioned. Right?
Well, I was gonna say to bless does not mean to support.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that and that term in my like listening or what I've been heard
Yeah.
has definitely been interchangeable.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I don't think it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
I
but I think it often is. We support them because we need to bless them.
Yeah.
But we don't do that in any other place. If somebody needs to be called out in something, we can bless them by doing that. And the Bible makes it clear that, when you rebuke a friend and they turn, that's a blessing. You've blessed your friend.
Yeah. And just discipline your children is like,
Yes.
There's a goodness in calling back to that's what we're supposed to do as a Christian community. And yet then we all of a sudden go, no, let Israel do whatever they want. In even Western evangelical circles, I'll kind of narrow it to there. That's still pretty wide. I'll say within this question, it's kind of hinting at, but I would thread out some of the language that I think has been oversimplified in most of the people I've heard talking about this on both sides, referring to just two different groups. Instead, I think there's actually three. I think there's Israel, the nation. I think there's the people of Palestine, and I think there's the organization of Hamas.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And those are getting the Hamas and Palestine are getting conflated into two or into one thing. And that is a massive mistake.
Yeah.
I will admit most of my exposure to this conversation was largely through Western evangelical circles. And though I didn't really fully buy it, I didn't have any other thinking or exposure till I met my friend Moody, who ran the restaurant here in town, talking with him growing up on the Gaza Strip and hearing what that looked like for him and his family within my lifetime and his.
Yeah.
Of the constant taking of land that was happening and overstepping and overstretching of the borders that were given in 1948, that has been really an atrocity.
Yeah.
Not only that, cutting off water and power supplies to people.
Yep.
I listened to a really good podcast on this that I will not be able to repeat any of the level of detail. Theology in the Raw, they had a guy recently on there talking about this whole thing. And he was really insightful. That's where he spent a lot of his career. So I'd really heavily encourage you to do that. But we've often, again, conflating in our thinking, the nation of Israel, the religious and spiritual grouping of Israel, and the Jewish people as a religious and a political and a national identity. And again, we use those terms all interchangeably, but that is not the same thing.
Yeah.
At all. And so to back Israel, the nation, is different than to back Israel, the spiritual people. This is just some of the stuff that was coming out of the podcast. The blessing that God promised Israel to have the land was when they would honor the covenant and follow it well and be his people. And therefore they got the land as they did that. It was fascinating to me to hear only about 25% of the people who are Israeli nationalists or live in the nation and hold citizenship are religious and Jewish.
Really? Only 25%?
Only 25% was what he was stating. And so
And some of those would be Christian, and some of those would be Muslim.
Sorry, maybe he was referencing just Jewish in that one.
Okay.
I think that
because there are, and we don't think about that
Yeah.
in the same way that we think about Muslim nations as entirely Muslim, and Muslims think about Canada and the States as completely Christian.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's not actually the way.
Totally. And so when only 25% of the nation is Jewish,
Wow.
honoring that covenant is clearly not happening. In fact, in 1948, when Israel was allowed to become a nation again, they went out of their way to make sure all of their political stuff was absent of religious language. And so there's a major different conversation, religious Israel and national modern Israel, and we use those terms interchangeably so much. Not to say that this group of people does not deserve to have safety and after the atrocities of World War II, but we just take all the nuance out of this conversation. And so, yes, I believe Israel needs protection and should be able to keep themselves safe, while not then stepping on the people of Palestine and Gaza and doing that. But as a result of the atrocities that have happened there and what Israel has done, there's a small fringe group of people who have decided we're going to take back our land, and through extreme measures, as often is the case with terrorism, it's a small group of people who want to use violent measures to make their point instead of going through other channels, have done the actions that we've seen and continue to see on the news. And so it's a whole mess. I feel for the people of Israel. Again, the stat I've heard, it's about the size of New Jersey state. have no idea relatively what that would be in Canada, but that's the language that's regularly being used. Surrounded by people who don't like it.
Yes.
That's a really difficult place to be in.
Yes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, to try to keep themselves as safe as possible, having done some of those things on this little tiny strip of Gaza and Palestine, has also not been right. So there's a lot that I feel for the people of Palestine. Never condoning the actions of Hamas, never saying Israel needs to lose their land, but it's just the conversation's messy.
I think that what should our response as Christians be to this conflict? God is always pro-life and pro the flourishing of life.
Yep.
And so I think our response should be sadness at the loss of life that's taking place. And should be grief. And out of that grief, lament. And out of that lament, intercession. Yep. I don't think there's anything else. I see in the world today and on the news, everything gets divided into camps. Yep. And if you're right wing, there's all of your positions, and if you're left wing, there's all of your positions, and they're just the opposite of each other.
Yep.
So if you're right wing, you support Israel, and if you're left wing, you support Palestine. Nothing is ever that simple, and we want simple because it's easy. We want it to be black and white, but it rarely is. And I just look at what's going on over there, and it just breaks my heart. I can remember a number of years ago when I was on, I was on Twitter, and there was some active conflict going on between Israel and Palestine. And for the second time today, I'm going to quote Brian Zond. He tweeted, no matter what your view of Israel, no matter what your religious upbringing causes you to think about Israel, no matter how much your church, views on Israel force you to support everything that they do. Yeah. Can you not, in the midst of this, at the very least, bless your enemies if you just think Palestine is enemies? Because that's the way of Jesus. And then he goes on and he talks about how Brian Zahn, had been to Palestine and preached in churches in Palestine to Palestinian Christians who are there trying to serve Jesus and follow Jesus in this occupied region. And there are churches in Israel, and not everyone in Israel supports everything Israel's doing, and not everyone in Palestine supports everything Palestine is doing. Yep. And nothing is as easy as we want it to think, and nothing is as easy as the news makes it appear, because the news just wants you to take a side and get angry, because as long as you stay angry, you're going to keep tuning in, because they'll just keep throwing another log on the fire of that anger, because it'll keep you tuning in, because it'll keep you watching their commercials so they can make more money. Yep. I don't want to sound cynical about the news, but I've, in the course of my life, become very cynical about the news. Yep. And that's not to say that there was ever a time of objective journalism, because journalism was always done by humans, and no human is objective. And I'm not claiming I'm objective. I'm not objective. But I think that when we look at this, there should be I think that the right starting point, and where you want to go from there, I'll leave that up to you. But I think the right starting point, if we don't start here, there's something wrong, is grief and lament at the loss of life that's taking place on both sides.
Yep.
I identify with the person who asked this question, because I think I typically think of myself as fairly naive. I think I grew up fairly sheltered in lots of good ways, but I just don't know a lot of stuff, right? Which is why I appreciate reading and meeting you guys and being forced to try and keep up and learn things in our world. But with Israel, like, this is and maybe it's only me, but like, I read the stories in the Bible. I have a very storybook version of what the characters look like. I always go back to saying, like, I have flannel graph ideas of what the characters look like, because that's what I was shown as a kid in Sunday school.
Totally.
So when I think of Israel, you just think of these people walking around like Bible times. And then I think that's what's still happening. Right. So when I hear Israel and Palestine have gone to war, which has happened a few times in my lifetime, I was just pulled up Wikipedia. Oh my gosh, like, there's a timeline here forever. Right. But and I'm like, well, when we need to support Israel, that's what I heard from, Christians. And I'm like, yay, Israel, like fight them. And I picture it like in a flannel graph kind of idea, right? But this time around, I feel like there's just so much more information available than there ever was, even like 5 or 6 years ago, whenever the last major conflict was. I don't feel like it was that long ago. I just know so much more about our world.
Right.
I know so much more about what modern Israel looks like.
Yep.
Even saying those stats about only 25%. And I also think living here in Canada, we have way more people from other regions in the world that have moved to Canada even in the last 5 or 6 years, that there is now this support of these other nations that just in my lifetime wasn't here not very long ago.
Yep.
It was like, whether you were a Christian, non-Christian, whatever, we were a democratic country, so we supported Israel.
Yep.
And now I'm hearing from social media and news outlets that, there's rallies going on. There's other things where people are supporting their home countries, saying, well, hang on, I support this.
Yep.
And like I say, just more information about what's going on.
Yep.
So it's definitely killed my little black and white picture of what Middle East conflict looks like.
Yep.
It's just way more gray. And I do back that, I think, like you guys have already been saying, with this Christian response rather than just a naive, like, worldly response to what's going on. Like, as Christians, my heart aches. I'm like, people are being killed. This is hard, right?
Yep.
So I just wanted to say, identify with whoever's asking the question.
Yeah.
A number of years ago, after Jaden died, and I was seeing a counselor, I was in this place where I was wrestling through whether I should continue being a pastor or not. And a part of that struggle was that the book of James, where it talks about, when someone's sick, call the elders of the church and they'll anoint them with oil and they'll pray and they'll be healed.
Yep.
It's like, okay, so here's the problem I have. I have a sick son. And I anointed him with oil many times, prayed for him many times. He wasn't healed. Yeah. Either that verse isn't right, or I'm not qualified to be an elder.
Right.
And I'm in this place where I'm really struggling with this. Yeah. And so I one of the sessions I had with my counselor, talking to them, and I'm talking this out, and they said, or there's a third option. And I was like, what's the third option?
Yeah.
And they said, I don't know, but there's always a third option. And I was like, that is the worst cop-out I have ever heard in my life. That is so lame. And over the years, I've come to appreciate those words spoken to me more and more and more.
Right.
They didn't have the third option, but neither did I, but they were just encouraging me to look for it.
Yeah.
And now I look at the words of Jesus, and Jesus over and over and over has presented A and B, and his answer is always C. And that's why everybody's always confounded by Jesus' answers, because he refuses to fall into the simple A-B narratives that humans always do. And I can't help but wonder why we in the church, in all the ways we're endeavoring to follow Jesus, that's one we don't seem to think about or to embrace, is to have this wisdom that sees things are more complicated than the A-B that I've been presented with. And I look at this situation and I just go, man, it is, as Kyle said, messy, and it's not simple. It is not easy at all. And there's no simple answer, but I know God is pro-life, pro the flourishing of life. And my response to it has been, I'll just go back to it again, grief and lament, and then intercession.
I think when we go back to even Old Testament Israel and the commands that God had given them, their hope was to be a blessing to all. And I will fully admit, there has been much blessing to the world that has come out since 1948 when Israel has been established. Like, the amount of technological innovation has far superseded the size of that nation. It has been incredible and beneficial to the whole of the world. But then you see the opportunity to be that blessing to the surrounding nations. And I think there's this internal part, like all of us, I want to defend what's mine. And so to protect it, and we see that on a political scale where it's happened to this degree, where then the closest, not even neighbors, like it's, as far as I understand the geography, like it's within the nation, Palestine, the Gaza Strip, are so suffering. Again, the podcast from Theology and the Raw was so good. He had all the information. Like the amount of money that they live on is so low, and they're not allowed to trade outside of the nation at all. Like their hopes for being able to succeed are so devastating. So again, part of me does understand the frustration to the point of, as a Christian, I don't think our response should ever be violence. But I understand that human nature I'm just going to fight for mine then because you're not giving it to me.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like, I get that. But I think the Christian response then is Jesus has called us to be peacemakers. So I would argue, I don't think we should be calling quickly for violence, if at all. As we've talked on this podcast, I would stand in a Christian nonviolent perspective myself. But I think we should be seeking for resolution as much as we can peacefully. And I know there has been a lot of offers on the table over the years to solve this conflict peacefully, and it just has not been done. And so, I don't know. Again, I don't have the answers by any means, but I think that third way is looking for ways to resolve, to bless, to be kind in that situation.
And on the flip side, I watched a YouTube video a while back of a Muslim whose grandparents lived in what became Israel.
Yeah.
And when the UN gave that land to Israel, this guy was saying the surrounding Muslim nations told all the Muslims to leave.
Yeah.
But when Israel was formed, it was like, you're more than welcome to stay here and to be Muslim. Right. We have no issue with you.
Right.
Let's just exist together.
Right.
And so you have at the beginning this narrative. Now, I don't know. This was one person's story, but he seemed very authentic and honest in telling it. And I go, I can totally see that. Yeah. I can totally see that when Israel was formed, they went to the people like, you don't have to become a Jew. Right. Let's just exist together. Right. Let's just be part of this thing together. Yeah. And then that obviously, when someone wrongs me, my response is I will retaliate. Yep. And you have since 1948 just the repetition of striking and retaliation, that only ever escalates.
Yep. To continue to add to the mess, I've also watched a documentary a couple of years ago and then actually saw again in multiple conversations. There are also groups of Jews, though, who don't think they should have the nation of Israel handed to them by the UN. Mm-hmm. That's something the Messiah was supposed to bring in. And so it's actually not supposed to be their land until the Messiah gives it, not the UN. Oh, wow. There was a group of Orthodox Hasidic Jews in New York protesting, no, we should give that land back. So just to add to the complexity.
But yeah, it goes back to we hear everything in terms of uniformity and black and white. Yeah. It is never that way.
No. So now that we've muddied the water sufficiently.
But I do think let your heart grieve.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that is the proper starting point. Yep. And if we don't start there, then I think we need to ask ourselves why. Yep. Either there's a hardness of our heart that is just built up over time, or maybe there is a prejudice that is there, or a bias that is there. I don't know, but I do think that of Jesus walking into Jerusalem in the book of Luke, riding into Jerusalem, right? Yep. And weeping. Oh, that you would have known the way of peace, but now it has been taken from you. Yep. That was not a one-time thing. No. I think that is the cry of God over the earth for as long as people have walked on it, or at least as long as the end of the Garden of Eden. Yep. Oh, that you would know the way of peace. And then you fast forward to Luke with Zechariah's prophecy at the end of Luke 1, where Jesus will come. He will guide our feet in the way of peace. Yeah. He will teach us how to walk in the way of peace. We are not peaceful people. Yep. We don't know how to walk in peace. And so we're terrible at peace.
Yep. Agreed.
Very true. All right, let's jump to the next question. If you could throw out the Sunday morning service playbook and totally reimagine what doing the life for Christ in community looks like, what would you do?
Ooh. I don't know that we have enough time to adequately answer this question.
Well, we might need a part 2 next time.
Yeah, maybe we can definitely continue it next time.
Maybe not. I have a lot of thoughts.
I do too.
I have a lot of thoughts on this.
Many. let's pull out some of the elements. Then maybe not specifics on how those might look, and that I think would be agreed upon, and even we would base scripturally out of 1 Corinthians. Like I think there's a call for coming together and a communal joining that no matter whether
First Corinthians. Why first? I'm thinking
is it
Hebrews and I'm thinking Acts.
Sorry, maybe I'm not thinking 1 Corinthians, where Paul talks about let one bring a psalm, let one bring a.
Okay, yeah, no, I was just thinking Hebrews, whereas
that's Corinthians,
don't forsake the joining together, and then Acts, the example of the early church.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking the 1 Corinthians where he mentions these different things of coming together, and then following our both Jewish and Christian and early church practices. Some of the elements that I think are always present in church history and always will be are elements of community and communal living, and time together. So that's kind of my hesitation around exclusively just to house church movements. Not that wasn't where our church began, but those were not house church movements like we see them today. And I see the limit of modern house church movements being 6 to 10 people that really like each other and are very similar in socioeconomic status, often race,
and often become very closed.
Totally, right? So that's the limit I see to house churches as they modernly are expressed, whereas the early church was probably 40 to 50 people from wide different backgrounds. So to thread the difference in language there.
And open to whoever would identify with that community.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I think there's a communal and uniqueness blend coming together. I think the ability to give honor and credit to God, whether that be through, as Paul puts it, a psalm or a song or anything like that. There's ways to give praise to God in that environment. We're not just a social club. That's important. And I think the third element for me that I would say has always been historically there, and I think is really important, is a small group of people who have had the time and privilege to learn the ways of God and of Scripture and to teach them to others, because not everybody has the time to do so. That has been consistent throughout our Jewish and Christian history, where I don't think it means need to be the one guy who knows everything, but I think a small group of people always will have a level of wisdom and study that then can be disseminated to everybody else. Because I look at, especially the modern world, most people don't take the time to learn. And I don't think they will. I've loved getting to do our long form teachings, and I bring a stack of books every time, 5 to 10 to 12 books, and I go, no, there's more things that have influenced me. And I go, I'm going to break down some of the concepts from these over the next hour and a half. Most people may come borrow a book or two. They won't get through all of them. And that's great that I get to do that. And so I think that kind of role in the midst of a gathering for somebody to teach and disseminate wisdom and learning of Scripture amongst the community and the distinction of people and give praise to God, those elements, period.
I would disagree with you that most people don't want to learn. I think not everybody wants to go as depth into learning as other people on every area.
Maybe that's a better clarification.
So I think some people don't want to learn.
Yeah.
But I think that when you do that long form teaching nights,
Yeah.
I think that probably there's people who go, this is interesting. I take use the example of
You're
fitness.
right. Yep.
Right? Like you and I have run ultras.
Yeah.
I want everybody to be fit.
Yep.
I think that that's an important aspect of life, that we should endeavor to care for and steward our bodies well, and part of that is fitness. It doesn't mean you need to run an ultra,
Yep.
but it means you need to be fit.
Yep.
So some people may go, I want to read that one book,
Yep.
but there's just different things. So I'll just leave that there.
Yeah. I'll add more after. But yeah, I agree.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say the level of there's an Einstein quote I heard: if you can't explain it simply, you don't know it well enough.
Yes.
Which is, I think, a really important thing for leaders to be able to do.
Absolutely.
And so even it's not that most people don't want to learn. I think some people are forced on how much they can learn because they have other things they have to learn for their job or for interest.
Yes.
Or I'm super into World War II, so I learn a lot about that. But then my pastor can help pass some information otherwise. So you're right. There's a limiting there, and so we then or here in that context, some spiritual leader gets to pass along more information
Correct.
that people aren't. Yeah, so that's better.
And I guess that's all I would say. Because yes, there's people who are like, let's look at the gentleman who's doing all our renovations.
Yeah.
Who right now at the church, who's very clearly has learned a lot about renovations and is using that to serve God in a way
Totally.
that I have no interest in learning those things.
Yep.
So I just wanted to clarify. So if I'm going to throw out the Sunday morning service playbook and totally reimagine what doing life for Christ in the community looks like, there's a couple of heart things that are going to be before there's any form things.
Right.
The first one is everyone's going to come because they want to learn.
Yeah.
Because people come to church for a variety of reasons.
Yep.
The second one is, and this may sound really weird, I think that there should be an element of church that should be more like an AA meeting than what church is.
Right.
Like, I think that church should be more like a Sinners Anonymous meeting.
Yep.
Like, there's something about Alcoholics Anonymous. You walk in and there's this honest confession. My name is so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic.
Yep.
And it's part of what they do is they own their sinfulness.
Yep.
They own their brokenness. They own their addiction, whatever term you want to use. We come to church and we act like we're all good.
Yep.
And I wish if I could totally just do church however I wanted to do it, we'd begin like with just people turning to each other and being like, can I just admit to you how badly I sinned this week? That there would be an honesty. And maybe that's completely unreasonable when you get a couple hundred people in a room, but there would be some element of honesty about our sinfulness.
Yep.
Because I feel like we are so unwilling to be honest about that we end up forfeiting a lot of the grace that God is constantly offering us because we spend so much energy trying to appear righteous. Yep. And it would be so cool if we could find a way to do church that people came together and they came in the same way that an alcoholic comes to AA, and we have an AA group that meets in this church, and it's wonderful to be able to help them with that. And you see them come in, and they're all in their admitted state of weakness, and they're all open to receiving help.
Yep.
And it's such a beautiful thing.
Yep.
It's amazing. And we come to church, and we all act like we're perfect, and we all act like we've got it all together.
Yep.
And we miss the gift that would be the support we could receive if we could find a form where we could come with that humility to acknowledge that we're all sinners.
Yep.
That's I actually thought of this week for some reason for a lot of time, but that's kind of the Romans chapter 7 thinking that Paul puts out there when he's talking about grace, right? He even makes the argument like, should we be sinful so that we experience God's grace? And of course he says no, but we take that and run so far the other way that we won't even acknowledge our sinfulness and totally miss God's grace all the time, right? Where if we're just able, like we shouldn't sin purposely to get God's grace, but if we just admit the sin that we do all the time, we would receive a lot more grace, or at least see God's grace in action more. And then I think of that. We always talk about Christianity or North America. It's always singular, like me, my individual thing. But if we did that in community, oh my gosh, how encouraging could that be to know that others are also sinful and also receiving God's grace? That would be cool. So
and so I think of James, confess your sins to each other that you will be healed. I think of 1 John, if we will confess our sins. And I think we take that and we're like, I confess my sin to Jesus because he is faithful and just, will forgive me for my sins and cleanse me from all unrighteousness. But there's a corporate element to John's letter that he's writing to a church. That this confession, I don't think was meant to be, I told Jesus, so now I don't have to tell you. But instead I told Jesus, so now I'm free to tell you. And I feel like I would love it if before we started talking about changing anything, if we started there.
That's fair. I heard it put at one point, we come to Jesus knowing how much we need him, and we spend the rest of our lives pretending we don't.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
You're not wrong. So, for the sake of time, I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, I was going to say
because I don't think
we have a lot
could get
more we can
into.
talk about.
Yeah, I think we could talk into this question a whole lot more, but we haven't even heard from Blake yet on this one.
No, I got some ideas.
So,
That
all
would
right,
be
let's
Stay tuned. Same bat
Cliffhanger.
place, same bat time. I'm going to run behind the sound booth.
There goes Kyle. If you're watching live, he's running.
I feel like now that Kyle's not at his mic to defend himself, he's nowhere near old enough to understand same bat time, same bat channel.
I did watch it on the retro channel.
Retro. We're old, Doug.
Well, there's times that I will say something to Kyle and he has no idea what I'm
No,
talking about.
totally.
So when he threw that out there, I'm like, nah, he really doesn't know where that comes from. So All right. I'll give him kudos. He did.
See y'all next week.